The Idaho Army National Guard has authorized more than 3,300 soldiers with units located in 25 communities across the state. There are 7 major subordinate commands: the 116th Cavalry Brigade Combat Team, the 1st of the 183rd Attack Reconnaissance Battalion, Joint Force Headquarters, the Installation Support Unit, the Retention and Recruiting Battalion, the 204th Regional Training Institute, and the Medical Detachment.
The Idaho National Guard has participated in every major U.S. conflict, and its origins predate the state itself. While Idaho was still a territory in the 1860s, volunteers formed militia companies to respond to disputes between the state's earliest settlers and its native population. A more formal territorial militia created by the territory governor existed from 1877 to 1879. These units were dissolved when they were no longer needed.
When Idaho became a state in 1890, the state's constitution required Idaho to establish a permanent state militia. The 1st Regiment of Idaho Infantry was organized in 1890, and the state approved the formation of the Idaho National Guard on March 14, 1891, to serve as the state's permanent militia. By the end of the year, the Guard consisted of 626 men. The governor would call upon this newly created unit just 6 months later to contain strikes at the Coeur d'Alene Mining District in 1892. This was a common task for National Guard units around the country at the time.
As the 1890s drew to a close, tension arose between the United States and Spain over Spain's control of Cuba. As war inched closer, Congress authorized the use of the regular Army and state militias. The governor activated the Idaho National Guard in 1898, and along with volunteers from around the state, formed the 1st Idaho Infantry Regiment of United States Volunteers. The federalized unit was sent to the Philippines in 1898 to fight in the Spanish-American War. President McKinley suspended war efforts just 3 days after the 1st Idaho reached the trenches. However, word was slow to reach the Philippines, so the unit continued to prepare for combat. The 1st Idaho remained in the Philippines to help stabilize the area until February 1899. In December 1898, the men were engaged in 2 battles with Filipino soldiers who were unhappy with the continued U.S. presence. 23 men from Idaho died in the conflict.
The conflict revealed the challenge of integrating the regular Army with volunteer forces. As a result, Congress passed the Militia Act of 1903, also known as the Dick Act, to reorganize state militias to meet Army standards.
During the summer of 1910, fires burned out of control in North Idaho, Northeast Washington, and western Montana in an area the size of Connecticut. The United States Forest Service was still new and underprepared to fight these fires on its own. President Taft sent federal troops to the area, and the governor sent the 2nd Idaho Infantry to assist them with the fires. This was the first time that the Idaho National Guard responded to a national disaster in conjunction with federal troops.
The Idaho Guard was federalized again in 1916 and deployed to the Mexican border under the National Defense Act, which reasserted the role and the importance of the National Guard and later led to the draft. This act also set the number of Guard training days to 48 and extended annual training to 15 days, which are still in use today. The Idaho National Guard performed outpost patrol duty for more than 5 months in Arizona and set itself apart from the other Guard units due to its previous training.
The Idaho National Guard's next federal activation would come just a year later, when in March 1917, units were activated to provide additional Guard duty throughout the state to protect federal property, bridges, and utilities from threat of German attack. After President Wilson declared war on Germany on April 4, 1917, Idaho soldiers reorganized into the 41st Division and became the 146th Field Artillery, the 116th Engineer Regiment, and the 146th Machine Gun Battalion. There are Idaho Guard units today that trace their heritage back to these units. Shortly after completing training, the units deployed to England and France. While in France, the 146th Field Artillery was equipped with the French 155 Grand Puissance Filou gun, which made it the first heavy artillery unit in the American Expeditionary Forces. After the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, the 146th Field Artillery was the only heavy artillery brigade to accompany the Third Army into Germany as part of the Army of Occupation.
After World War I, Congress passed additional legislation to strengthen the National Guard. This legislation, the National Defense Act of 1920, shaped the National Guard into the fighting force that resembles what we know today. Guardsmen's pay became equivalent to active Army pay, and the Guard was represented by a general at the national level for the first time, and annual inspections were established.
Continuing with the music, we call on the 20-piece dance band of your Idaho National Guard 25th Army Band of Caldwell. Here's an arrangement with a nice beat.
After the war, Idaho units were organized into the 148th Field Artillery, the 116th Cavalry, and the 186th Infantry, which would become the 200th Infantry in 1924. In 1936, the Idaho Guard had 234 horses, but would soon move into the mechanized era when the 116th Cavalry converted into the 183rd Field Artillery in 1940 and said goodbye to its horses. By 1940, the Idaho National Guard's 2,500 soldiers were well trained and ready for war if needed.
On September 16, 1940, 1,833 of those soldiers were mobilized and sent to Fort Lewis, Washington to receive a year of training. Those units were the 148th Field Artillery Regiment, the 116th Engineer Regiment, and the 116th Ordnance Company. The 116th Cavalry Regiment, which was reorganized as the 183rd Field Artillery Regiment, followed suit in April 1941. At Fort Lewis, draftees were added to the unit ranks and the training year was extended to 18 months. The 148th Field Artillery was deployed to the Philippines to reinforce Lieutenant General Douglas MacArthur in November 1941. After Pearl Harbor was attacked, the 183rd guarded the beaches of Washington from possible Japanese landings. Immediately following Pearl Harbor, the Army reorganized artillery and engineer regiments into battalions for easier incorporation with combat groups. Idaho's regiments were broken into battalions, including the 148th Field Artillery Battalion, the 183rd Field Artillery Battalion, and the 116th Combat Engineer Battalion. Over the next 2 years, Idaho Guard units fought in both the Pacific and European theaters of World War II.
Idaho Guardsmen fought in New Guinea, aboard the sunk Port Mar on Australia's coast, and in the Philippines. Idaho units earned 4 campaign streamers in the Pacific, including 2 with arrowheads, indicating that they were among the initial assaulting forces in those campaigns. In Europe, Idaho Guard units blocked the Axis troops from moving south in Tunisia, Africa, fought in Italy, landed on Utah Beach just 9 days after D-Day, and continued fighting in Belgium and Germany. Units earned multiple campaign streamers on the European front as well.
The Idaho National Guard consisted of only Army forces until 18 September 1947, when the United States Air Force and Air National Guard were created. Prior to then, the branch was part of the Army Air Corps.
Construction began on Gowan Field in 1941. The base was used to train bomber crews during World War II for the Army Air Corps. Gowan Field was named for First Lieutenant Paul Gowan, a pilot from Caldwell who died in a 1938 plane crash in Panama. Today, Idaho Army National Guard units, the Idaho Air National Guard, the Army, Marine, and Navy Reserves call Gowan Field home.
In 1948, the Idaho Guard owned 1 armory and rented 20. This changed after Congress passed a law in 1950 that allowed states to build armories, with the federal government providing 75% of the cost. By 1966, the Guard owned 22 armories around the state.
In 1950, the 116th Combat Engineer Battalion federalized and received advanced infantry and engineer training before reporting to Korea in 1951. The unit built over 150 miles of roads and erected more than 21 bridges to keep main supply routes running while participating in combat operations as necessary. The 116th Engineers were the first National Guard unit stationed inside the 10th Corps Combat Zone in Central Korea. Most Idaho soldiers returned home by the summer of 1952, while the unit remained in Korea until 1955. The 116th Engineers received the United States Distinguished Unit Citation, 2 Korean Presidential Unit Citations, and 6 campaign streamers for its service in Korea.
In response to East Germany building the Berlin Wall in 1961, President John F. Kennedy ordered National Guard and Reserve units to active duty for 1 year. More than 600 men from various Idaho Army Guard units were sent to Fort Lewis, where they trained for 10 months before being deactivated.
In 1968, the 116th Combat Engineer Battalion once again deployed, this time to South Vietnam, where it spent a year in the central region of the country. This deployment was consistent with the unit's tradition and history of serving in every major U.S. conflict since Idaho became a state. The 116th Engineers built roads and bridges, improved airfields, and constructed other projects in civil action programs. Like in Korea, the engineers also saw combat action. The unit earned the Meritorious Unit Commendation for its outstanding service in Vietnam.
The 116th Engineers was the only National Guard battalion to participate in both the Vietnam and Korean Wars. It would be another 20 years before another Idaho Army National Guard unit deployed to another war zone, as units spent the 70s and the 80s participating in training exercises both overseas and throughout the state, while also providing support to the state for wildfires and floods.
In 1989, the 116th Armored Cavalry Regiment was redesignated as an Armored Cavalry Brigade, and the aviation assets became a standalone Aviation Attack Battalion. The Aviation Battalion became the first of the 183rd, inheriting that unit's lineage. The reorganization changed the brigade's mission from reconnaissance and surveillance to a primary combat role and required soldiers to undergo extensive training on new equipment. The brigade upgraded from the M60 Patton to M1 Abrams, and the Aviation Battalion transitioned from UH-1 Hueys to AH-64 Apache helicopters. Gowan Field soon became home to the Regional Training Institute. As a result of the transformation, it continues to provide full-time training support to active, Guard, and Reserve units from across the country.
In 1990, 10 members of the Idaho Army National Guard deployed to Kuwait in support of Desert Shield, Desert Storm. In addition, Idaho Guard instructors from the Regional Training Institute deployed across the country to train tankers and tank mechanics before those units deployed to Kuwait.
The 148th Public Affairs Detachment, which consisted of about 10 soldiers, landed in Kuwait just hours before the war began. The detachment accompanied the 3rd Armored Division into battle and was the most forward-deployed public affairs detachment in the theater. We published the only divisional newsletter during the conflict.
100 years after serving in the Spanish-American War, the 116th Cav Brigade Combat Team deployed stateside in 1998 to the National Training Center in Fort Irwin, California. The 3-week rotation through the nation's premier training environment involved the deployment of over 5,000 soldiers and 4 force-on-force brigade-sized engagements against a seasoned opposition force. The experience would serve the unit well in the years prior to the follow-on mobilization and deployment to Iraq in 2004.
From June 2002 to April 2003, the 1st of the 183rd Attack Reconnaissance Battalion deployed to Bosnia-Herzegovina as the Aviation Task Force for S-412. The unit deployed with its Apaches and conducted reconnaissance, security, and air movement operations in support of the Dayton Peace Accords. The battalion completed more than 800 missions and flew in excess of 3,000 accident-free hours, as well as conducted numerous humanitarian relief operations to the war-torn nation.
After 9/11, the Idaho Army National Guard responded several times to the global war on terrorism. The 116th Cavalry Brigade Combat Team deployed to Kirkuk, Iraq in 2004 in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom 3, and to Baghdad in 2010 for Operation New Dawn. These year-long deployments were among the largest in the state's history.
The 1-183rd deployed to Afghanistan for Operation Enduring Freedom in 2006, where it provided the core of attack aviation for the 10th Mountain Division. In 2012, Idaho's Black Hawk Company, the 1-168, also deployed to Afghanistan for a year.
Four deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan in 8 years showed once again that the Idaho Army National Guard stood ready to serve the nation when called upon. Just as they had in previous wars, Idaho soldiers were awarded multiple medals for their service and overcame adversity on the battlefield.
From the state's earliest days, the Idaho Army National Guard has established a long tradition of service to the state and to the nation, both in war and peace. The Guard's legacy is something all former and current members can be very proud of.